Also, to try and create resilience in my career, it's a time for me to explore entrepreneurship and learn some skills that are transferable in this new era of work where big companies are going to become increasingly challenged to perform the way they once did. They're going to have to change dramatically the way they do their business, or they're not going to survive. And we've seen evidence of that already in the 4 years since I've left the corporate world.
Yeah.
And we need to have, as leaders, need to build new skills, which, what got us here won't get us there. So Adrian, I spent 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week in
Welcome to the Quit and Switch podcast, and today I'm joined by Matt Burns. Matt Burns is an award-winning executive, social entrepreneur, and a speaker. Matt, welcome to Quit and Switch. How are you doing today?
I'm looking forward to the chat. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for asking. It's an exciting journey, starting a brand new podcast, trying to give a different angle to what's already out there in the market as a podosphere, as you would imagine, as a podcaster yourself, which we will talk about. So I'm really excited. Thank you for spending some of your time with me.
Yeah, of course. Happy to help.
Excellent. So Matt, let's go straight into it. So I want to find out from you. Tell us a bit about your career in HR and your transition from being a HR leader to becoming a podcaster and a founder.
Yeah, it's kind of funny now. It's 2023 and we just gone through about 3 years of real tumultuous times. I kind of feel like my career has very much modeled what's happened in broader society, except that I've always made the jump a couple of years before the inevitable change. Now, to be fair, I didn't predict the pandemic, nor could I see that coming, but I knew we were entering into a new era of work where skills were going to become more transferable, where work was going to become more flexible. At the time, I had spent 20 years in the corporate world, 15 of them in HR. And Adrian, I spent a lot of years in HR roles, frankly, architecting large transformational projects, which in plain speak is I was helping organizations let go thousands of people. That was my job.
Wow.
So I was supporting restructuring companies, mergers and acquisitions. And a consequence of those activities often is people lose their jobs. It's not pleasant, but it's the reality of publicly traded companies in large sectors. Now, I'd done that for many, many years and got to a place where I realized, while this is certainly valuable work in the context of the organizations, it wasn't really what I wanted to do with my career. It wasn't really filling up my cup, as it were. And I also started to ask myself, well, if I'm seeing a lot of people lose their jobs because of no fault of performance or loyalty or tenure, they don't really have the same flexibility. They find themselves in a lot of positions they're stuck. And I also looked at myself in the mirror and said, well, I'm not much different than them. The only difference is that I'm the one building the spreadsheet, not the name on the spreadsheet. So I said to myself, for the reasons of getting better purpose, but also to try and create resilience in my career, it's a time for me to explore entrepreneurship and learn some skills that are transferable in this new era of work where big companies are going to become increasingly challenged to perform the way they once did. They're going to have to change dramatically the way they do their business, or they're not going to survive. And we've seen evidence of that already in the 4 years since I've left the corporate world.
Yeah.
And we need to have, as leaders, need to build new skills, which, what got us here won't get us there. So Adrian, I spent 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week in meetings, running meetings. That was my job. And I had a title and I had a team and I had a mandate. But the reality was the actual skills that I was practicing was starting a meeting, taking down action items, delegating responsibilities, hosting the meetings. That was my job as an executive. And I went, this doesn't feel like a skill that's going to be super transferable in a world where there's AI, where there's machine learning, where there's virtual reality. So let me do what I do best, which is throw myself into an opportunity without much air cover, learn some new skills as an entrepreneur. And you know this yourself, being an entrepreneur, like you have to learn how to be a salesperson and a marketer and an operations executive. You have to get right down into the weeds. And I hadn't been in the weeds for so long. I felt out of touch. So I said, okay, let's take the skills that I have from the corporate world. I have relationships, I have knowledge, I have expertise, but let me start my own business in such a way that I can learn some of these skills, translate them for the new world, and then ultimately be of better service to those large companies that I ultimately worked in, because I bring the large enterprise experience for companies that are 10,000 and above, but I also bring experience now in the startup world to say, which of the best ways are going about doing things, and I can bring both together. That led to the podcast. The podcast, Adrian, came from two reasons. The first one was, frankly, during the pandemic, I was struggling for human connection. I
Whoa.
lived by myself, didn't live with a family. And of course, we're all locked down. And I said, well, one thing I missed about going to the office, being in a corporate environment, was conversations. So not only was I not in an office environment, I was now an entrepreneur. So my team was very, very small. So I didn't have the same social connection that I once did. Podcast was a great way for me to have conversations, meet interesting people. And let's be honest, Adrian, you know this, when we're having conversations with people on LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram, whatever it might be, you say to someone, hey, Adrian, do you want to have a chat on Friday at 5 o'clock? You'd be like, but hey, Adrian, do you want to hop on a podcast at Friday, 5 o'clock? It's absolutely. So the podcast was a great way to start that, and building my business, a great way to raise brand profile, raise awareness, and ultimately use it as a method to build relationships in a non-threatening way versus let's have a sales conversation or let's just meet for coffee on Friday. Just a non-threatening way to build relationships. And fast forward 4.5 years later, it's been an absolutely incredible journey. I've met some amazing people such as yourself, and obviously learned a lot about the business world in its entirety. So probably a longer answer than you were expecting, but that's kind of my path to get to this point and how podcast things kind of fit into all that.
Wow, that's a handful, Matt. Really appreciate you sharing that. You touched on a lot of golden nuggets right there, Matt. You talked about podcasting as how podcasting can, be a vehicle for, helping out with isolation, opening doors in terms of selling to people in a relational way rather than kind of like a cold way. And also you talked about how just the world of work has just pivoted a lot since COVID. It's gone through a lot of transformation, remote working, work from home, the great resignation. I mean, there's a lot happening as well. And you were able to, see that firsthand when all of that was happening during COVID. And it seems like COVID was, as bad as COVID was, it seems like it was a blessing for you, because what it did is that it created opportunities for you to actually move out from the executive role you're doing into taking control more of of your business and being able to give something valuable to the world, which is your podcast, which is your consultancy, and so many other wonderful things that I've seen that you're doing, including advising other executive businesses and individuals. Thank you for sharing that. That's fantastic, Matt. Thanks for sharing your journey. And what I want to know now is, okay, you know what? Let's talk about the podcast, because you just landed at that right at the end. Let's talk about thinking inside the box. So I think it's a no-brainer name. I think the name kind of gives away what it means, thinking inside the box rather than outside of the box, because it's all about looking at work and culture issues inside the organization rather than outside the organization. And could you tell us a bit about the podcast and some memorable conversations you've had, and and how I think you told me why the podcast came about, and just share some memorable conversations you've had with some of your guests as well. Congratulations, congratulations on 146 episodes, by the way.
Thank you. I never thought I'd get there. I didn't know that I'd get to 100, but now it keeps rolling, and I'm looking forward to continuing it for the rest of my professional life. So we can touch base when I've hit 1,000 next time. For me, it's an interesting journey. So thinking inside the box, the name does speak to inside the box in the context of inside of organizations. So you hit that right. And frankly, Adrian, most people miss that. What I lead with publicly and what it means in terms of the tagline is constraints driving innovation, meaning I've worked in environments predominantly where we didn't have a lot of resources. So I mentioned before restructuring. Restructuring came as a result of businesses needing to fundamentally pivot and shift the way that they did their business because maybe the environment has changed. So a good example, I helped an organization transfer from traditional brick and mortar retail to more of an e-commerce format. Customers were increasingly buying groceries and products and services online. This business traditionally had large big box stores, and that's where customers did all of their shopping. But moving to an online format meant the business had to change the way they did things. They had to change the way they sourced products, change the way their stores operated, and they had to free up resources to be able to invest in their online business, which, as you know, is a very different business model than traditionally, having a big box brick and mortar store. That change is a constraint. The company has X amount of dollars to spend, but they want to reallocate their spend to other parts of the business. Mm-hmm. That requires an examination of the company and requires them to use their finite resources more effectively for the future. I once had a coach, really bright guy, who said to me, Matt, constraints drive innovation. And the context was kind of unique in which it came up, which was, one time I came down to his office and he said, Matt, I want you to lead this project. It's a high profile project. It's going to take you 6 to 12 months, lots of visibility, high pressure. And I want this done within this period of time. And I looked at him and said, this should take 2 to 3 years. And I think we don't have enough resources to be able to achieve the goals we've set out. Can we talk about changing the timeline? Can we talk about adding more resources? Can we talk about, negotiating so that I can do the job really well, given what you've outlined as the goals? Mm-hmm. And he looked at me with a smile on his face and said, Matt, constraints drive innovation, meaning figure it out. So as a consequence, I went and said, okay, what things can't I control? I can't control the timeline. I can't control the budget. I can't control the resources. But what I could control is the types of the way we went about doing the work and how we would partner with people in the organization to ultimately realize the benefits of the project. So it taught me a really strong lesson around, and this is a lesson we all can apply both professionally and personally. Sometimes you can't change your circumstances. You have fixed income. You live where you live. You're born where you were born. You're in the family you're in. Yeah. You have to make the best of your situation. Constraints driving innovation is a mantra that I've carried on in further careers and now on the podcast. And it's meant to illuminate that people have the opportunity to do more with what they have if they're willing to look at the problem through a different lens. Now, the lens at which I apply that is, to your point, through mm-hmm. large organizations, through companies. And I've been blessed to meet with a lot of guests along the way that have told some really cool stories. And Adrian, you'll appreciate this. Most of the guests that I meet where I'm excited about who they are, oftentimes I find underwhelming when I meet with them. It's the ones that I don't have high expectations for that I go, wow, that was a really cool conversation that came out of nowhere that I'm like, that's a life-changing chat. A couple examples. This one probably bridges both. But I met with Sim Sukut. Sim Sukut is the former CIO or Chief Information Officer for the government of Estonia. Why is that important? Well, about 10 years ago, the government of Estonia launched what they call an e-residency program, meaning that people from all around the world can apply for e-residency in Estonia, and then you can set up a business and have essentially a digital nomad work permit, which was unavailable in any other country and is still unavailable in our two countries right now. You have to apply for residency, live in the country, and then that's how you get a job permit. But in Estonia, because it's a smaller country and because they're moving more to a digital interface, they actually have more people applying for e-residency permits every year than they birth children in the nation.
That's
because
crazy.
They've created a less barrier to entry. It's a completely innovative way of thinking about citizenship, about thinking about work, about thinking about how to use technology effectively. So we had an incredible hour-long conversation where he talked about where they came from, what drove the thinking, how they were able to move this thinking through a government environment, which is bureaucratic to say the least, and then prove the results and making it effective. And they're now a leader, and Estonia is seen as a leading nation around the digital use of governments. That's one. I met with Oscar Trimboli about 3 weeks ago, and Oscar's an expert on listening. And I talk for a living. I don't listen for a living. And for me, listening is a skill that I'm always trying to improve. And Oscar had an incredible way of just talking about basic, practical, pragmatic ways to listen, whether as a leader, as a partner, as a brother, as a friend, so that you could be more effective. And yes, some of it is common sense, but some of it also was unique. I'll give you an example. Now, every meeting that I set up in my calendar, if it was supposed to be a half an hour, it's set up for 25 minutes. Why? Because most people are running from meeting to meeting, even in digital world, and they're all showing up late. So I start my meetings at 5 after, either the hour or the half hour. So if you're running from one meeting to the next, you're never late for my meeting. You're always on time. And if you get there on time, we have 5 minutes just to catch up and chill and relax. And then I'll get you out of the meeting a couple minutes early as well, so you can get to your next meeting on time. So I'm more thoughtful in the planning around, very simple. My Zoom meetings are 20 to 25 minutes long, which gives you time back in your schedule. They're more efficient, but ultimately people arrive on time. It's much more structured and therefore much more productive versus back to back to back to back to back to back meetings. Inevitably, you're going to stack up being late over consequent meetings over and over and over again. And then you're just playing catch up. You're showing up to the meeting frenetic and stressed. Your mind's in 5 different places. I set it up so that people can show up, take a breath, be present, and ultimately be more effective in the short time that we have together. Oscar taught me that. I've already brought that in practice into my business all over the place. So a couple of examples of guests. There's 146 people. So, I mean, there's a lot of cool stories amongst them, but those are 2 that for me stand out right now.
Wow, Matt, that's a very, very interesting points you've just shared. There's a lot of value bombs in there. We're definitely going to direct our listeners to your podcast, Thinking Inside the Box. I'm sure there's a whole lot of value they can get from there. I definitely got some value from your latest guest, Wolfgang Bremer. And he was talking about the intersection of the designs, and also he was talking about how he'll have to design in such a way where when the business scales, that him and his team are able to grow with the business as well. So some very interesting takeaways from that episode. I really enjoyed that one. I want to double tap, Matt, on what you said in terms of constraints drive innovation. I think that's very, very true. When you look at different perspectives in life, you hear the saying, pressures create diamonds. There's also a previous guest of mine who's also a podcaster, Kwame Christian. He runs Negotiate Anything, the number one negotiation podcast in the world. And one thing he loves to say is the best things in life are on the other side of tough negotiations. So I think this all kind of lines up with all these different quotes and sayings that are going around. Matt, this is a very, very fantastic conversation. I'm really enjoying. I want to move on and talk about. I want to talk about what tips you would give to those that want to transition into HR and the digital transformation space.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think it's unfolding for all of us and myself included. And we both came from an era, Adrian, where it was acceptable and almost expected that you join a career, you spend 20, 30, 40 years in a single profession, and then you retire. That's completely changing. Now careers are happening in smaller increments. Not only are you leaving jobs more frequently, but you might actually have 2 or 3 or 4 careers over the course of your working life. You may start out as a graphic designer or a podcaster or a copywriter, and then you become an accountant or you become a lawyer, and you go back to them being an actor. Like there's people are taking on different chapters of their career, or they're managing multiple hustles at the same time. That's very different than what it was even 10, 15 years ago. So I think what I would say for folks is understand where you are. And this is where your friends, your colleagues, your family can be really brutally honest with you. What skills do you have? What experiences do you have? What passions do you have today? So what things fill out your profile in today's world? Write that list down. What do you want to do in the future? And how does that fit into where the world is going? And I get it. It's hard to put out a crystal ball. It's hard to say 20 years from now, here's how the world's going to be, because some things like the pandemic, we couldn't see coming. But here's some things we do know that are going to happen. Artificial intelligence is going to proliferate to the point where manual administration is going to go away. It's already going away in a lot of careers now. Bookkeepers, construction, taxi drivers, food and restaurant industry, cashiers in retail locations, any of those jobs that were repetitive, administrative, and tactical, a lot of those jobs are being automated or they're being outsourced entirely. So if you're in one of those careers today and you have 10, 15 years left in your working life, you may want to consider what's your next era, what's the next chapter of your career, and make that decision now from an empowered place versus being pushed out and then having to react to what's available to you in that moment. So what I would do then is establish what skills that you have today, what are your interests in the future, and then build the plan between the two. And I get it. It's hard. We're all working way too many hours. We have too much on our plate. So how are we going to find time for learning and development? But you got to make the time, because if you don't make the time now, you're going to be chasing your tail 5, 6, 7, 10 years from now when you realize your skills are out of date, you're lost touch with reality, and that the market has passed you by. That's a terrible situation. And you can't count on governments and organizations and the people around you, in a lot of cases, to prop you up. You're going to have to look after yourself. And the great thing is if you do that in the short term, you can leverage your network, you can leverage your skills, you can leverage the people around you. Education is now also different than what it once was. You don't have to go to school for 8 years to be an expert at something. You can go on YouTube and you can watch videos. You can take free courses on Coursera. You can get practical experience through volunteer work. There's lots of things that you can do to round out your knowledge. Most of the freelancers I talk to don't have professional certifications, but they have experience. They've taught themselves. They've learned from their friends on how to be copywriters or be graphic designers or data scientists. They've learned on their own. So I would encourage folks to start to think about what that next chapter of their career might be and then start to build the skills now while you have time versus tomorrow, your job's gone. Now you have to scramble and find something that makes sense. It's just, that was one of the things that drove me to leaving the corporate world. So people say, Matt, that's good feedback, but it's really hard to leave something that's comfortable. I get it. I was a corporate executive. I was earning a very comfortable salary. I had a very comfortable life. And I, out of partly driven from this conversation, felt the necessity to disrupt my own career. And as a consequence of that, my life has greater flexibility than it ever did before. I'm more empowered than I ever have been before. And I'm ultimately happier than I ever have been before. And yes, I make more money as well, which is a nice consequence of that, but it's not the most important thing. The fact that I can live and work from anywhere, that I can choose and live where I work from and who I work with, those are skills I didn't have and privileges I didn't have 5 years ago in the corporate world, where you're told what to do, when to do it, how to do it. Now I have much more flexibility. I wouldn't have gotten to that place if I hadn't taken a step back, disrupted myself, been vulnerable, made a ton of mistakes along the way, and then rebuilt myself to where it actually is coming together. Now you're catching me at a good time, Adrian. I'm 5 years into the journey. If we talked 4 years ago, I would have been looking a little bit more underslept and stressed out, and my health wasn't always as good. And that was part of the consequence of making that change of what was comfortable into what's less comfortable. I did that because I was trying to accelerate my path through that plan. If folks can do that now and do so in a more thoughtful way, you don't have to go through the same pains that I went through. Do it for yourself.
Powerful. Matt, I must say, this is one of the best interviews I've done in my life. I will say that, even though I've done more than 100 episodes of my other podcast, this is absolutely powerful. Honestly, thank you so much for coming on, Matt.
Of course.
I wanna say that there's a common theme in the conversation we've had today, is looking at what you can control and not what you can't control. As you're talking about earlier on, you can't control the time, you can't control the budget, you can't control the timeline, but you can control other variables as well. And also, I think, touching on what you said, Matt, just double tapping on what you said, also is for everybody listening, is to really take advantage of all of the resources, the internet, everything out there. There's so much out there for you to learn in terms of moving into a career transition or business transition. Matt has definitely done that within the past 5 years, and look where he is today. So it's definitely feasible for everyone to make the move into what career, business, or industry they're trying to transition into, and in particular HR and digital transformation. Matt, you've been a phenomenal guest. Before I ask listeners to go and before I ask listeners to go and listen to your podcast and ask them where they can find you, are there any final announcements or words that you'd like to leave with the listeners?
I think more than anything, and this is advice I should have given myself over the 5 years that I've been there, is just be kind to yourself. The world is more challenging today than it was 5 years ago. It's not just you. It's not just that you're lazy or that you're not smart or that you didn't make the right decisions. The world has gotten more difficult. Things like income inequality, housing affordability, the pandemic, the economic conditions, it's more difficult today than it was to have success. Even if you've made all the right decisions, even if you've worked really, really hard, even if you sacrificed along the way. So I would say be kind to yourself, understanding that kindness can be extended first within. And then if you're struggling at any point, whether it's with mental health or with depression or with, just struggling for motivation, to make sure you have a strong community around you that can lift you up and that you can lift people up as well. I would not be where I am today without a strong community around me that were able to help me in some of those darker days, give me words of encouragement, give me tough feedback when I needed to hear it. Those kind of things allowed me to have success, and I'm eternally grateful, which is why I try and give as much back as I can now and try and pay that forward, so that it's my way of saying thank you to the folks that helped me along the way. And I'm looking forward to doing more of that in the future. So keep an eye on what we're doing, Thinking Inside the Box podcast, or check me out on LinkedIn. I'm on there pretty much all the time. We'd be happy to connect, have a conversation at any point.
No problem. We'll leave all of the links and resources and nuggets from this episode on the show notes episode. You guys can head over to www.quitandswitch.co/Matt Burns. That's quitandswitch.co/Matt Burns for all of the show notes from today's episode. Matt, you've been a fantastic guest. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.